This evening, we have the great pleasure of trying to understand our carbon footprint with Susan Atkinson and John Purser. Forgive me, I'll pick up a cheat sheet. Hopefully I won't need it. They are both members of the Citizens Climate Lobby. John's interest in government policy and the impact of government policy led him to degrees in economics and in information sciences from the University of California, Santa Cruz. He spends a fair amount of his time lobbying in DC and locally around the country, looking for solutions to climate problems. Susan Atkinson does the same, but also writes opinion pieces and has been published in the USA Today and in 17 different states around the country, working to find a bipartisan solution or bipartisan steps we can take to hopefully address and solve, that's a pretty aggressive word, solve the climate crisis. They're both Durangoans. They enjoy playing in the outdoors and they enjoy playing together in the outdoors. So which one of you is going to start?
I'm going to start. All right, thank you. Thank you all for coming. This is actually the second time John and I have been able to have the honor of being with Lifelong Learning. The last one was pre-COVID. It's an honor, and I'm especially appreciative of this program. It's a gift to our community. Okay, the clicker.
Here you are.
Okay, so the topic, understanding our carbon footprint. Not blocking anyone's view in mind. Okay. Understanding carbon footprint, carbon offsets, and carbon pricing. So I asked why would I want this topic to be the topic of the day? And to answer that, I'm going to quote from Jane Goodall, the world's foremost chimpanzee expert and anthropologist. She says, "You cannot get through a single day without having an impact on the world around you. What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make." So the first part of this presentation, I'll be talking about your individual impact that you make, and that will be on the carbon footprint and carbon offsets. The second part of the presentation will be by John. He'll be speaking about carbon pricing, which is the most effective and efficient solution for the climate problem. So let's define carbon footprint. Yeah, I'm sure you all know it is the emissions, the CO2 emissions that are generated from an entity, a person, or producing a product. By the way, I have the resource sheets. I put some extras at the back of the room in case you didn't get one. A lot of the things that I'll be talking about, you might want to reference. And so the sheet has the information already down for you. All right. In speaking about the carbon footprint, often what we think of is the operating cost of a product. So if it were a electric vehicle, well, the operating cost is very low in an electric vehicle. But there's a lot more involved than just the operating cost. We're going to be looking at the full life cycle analysis. So it's manufacturing, its use, and then its disposal. It's all part of the life cycle analysis of a carbon footprint. The source of what I'm using for most of my information today is a book called The Carbon Footprint of Everything by Mike Berners-Lee. He's a British author. If you want to take a deep dive into the carbon footprint, it's a great book. It's an audio version as well as print. And he is a consultant worldwide to corporations on how to reduce their carbon footprint. Balancing your needs. Everyone is different. So I have done a lot of soul searching, a lot of grappling with making decisions that involve my carbon footprint, which is basically everything, because we all consume. And so what I came up with that is best able for me to answer the question, how do I make impactful carbon footprint choices? And so there's a list, if you've ever heard of a practice called nonviolent communication, they have a list of universal needs that all human beings have. This is just a very small portion of the list of needs. And we're all responsible for meeting our own needs. And so the question I pose to myself is, how do I meet my own needs and do it in a low carbon footprint way? So here's an example. I have a strong need for connection to my family, connection to my friends, and often to support that connection, to meet that need for connection, I go on trips. And that meets my needs for fun, for play, for adventure, and rest and relaxation. So it also has a carbon footprint to go on those trips. So I also have a need at the same time for the other needs that I mentioned. I have a need for meaning, that my life has meaning. I have a need for protection, that future generations are protected to the degree that's possible from the effects of climate change. And climate change is something that we are fast approaching the point of no return. And this is a critical time in history for us to make an impact or not, as Jane Goodall says, what kind of difference do you want to make? So here's an example. Well, no, I'm not going to give an example. I started to give an example. So the question that I constantly ask myself is, how do I balance all the needs that I have and do it in a responsible way that has a low carbon impact? And it's not a question I just ask myself once and say, oh, okay, I have the answer now, and I'm going to make my decisions today based on that. But it's an ongoing, for many years, I ask myself that question at least weekly, if not daily, if not several times a day, and taking my carbon impact, my carbon footprint into account when I make choices. Oops. Oh, this is where that slide was with the JOMO.
No,
Is that-
you asked me to put it in.
Oh, it did. Okay, well, I wonder if I can fast forward.
There it is.
There, okay. So,
Your mic went out.
is the mic still here? Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, so, sorry about that, John. So I recently just saw this meme on Facebook, and it was just classic for me. JOMO stands for the joy of missing out. Feeling content with staying in and disconnecting as a form of self-care. And it's an antonym for FOMO. Has anyone, who here in this room has heard of FOMO? Fear of missing out, right? So our bucket lists are very often based on fear of missing out. We don't want to be on our deathbed, have regrets, look back and say, oh, I shoulda, coulda, woulda done all these lists on my bucket list and I didn't do them. And we see our peers doing that. It's a very socially accepted thing to have a bucket list. And I like this because it was countering, JOMO is countering the FOMO, the fear of missing out. I recently came across a podcast, thanks to Becky. Where's Becky in the audience? Yes, thank you. Becky gave a great presentation about carbon footprint. And she turned me on to this podcast that's interviewing Arthur Brooks. Arthur Brooks is a Harvard professor who specializes in happiness. And Arthur Brooks came out with something he calls the reverse bucket list. And I listened to it and it really kind of reframed for me about happiness and the difference between pleasure seeking and happiness, and that you can be happy without a bucket list, without check marks on that, done that, and that our happiness really comes from our connection with others and not necessarily with the things that we think bring us happiness. Okay, so now a big reverse. Yeah, there we go. CO2 emissions by country, I think it's good to look at how do we rate in the world. So gross emissions of CO2 per ton. China is the most, US next in line. So these are the 4 top countries. Interesting to note, if the United States had the same population that China does, then our figure right here would be 20 billion tons. CO2 emissions per capita. So here's top 4 countries, United States being the top in terms of carbon emissions of the top 4 countries, although the highest emitting country down here is Palau, 59 tons per person. But Palau is such a tiny little country that it's pretty insignificant, their carbon footprint. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, puts the United States emissions per, I keep thinking the laser, here we go. Says the emissions is more like 15 to 16 tons per person. I went to, you can calculate your own carbon footprint if you're interested to see how you kind of stack up against the national average. So I went to a carbon calculator site called Cool Climate. It's one of your references on your sheet. Calculated based on my household, my income, where I live, that I drive an all-electric vehicle, all those things. My carbon footprint still came out to the average 14. And that's with, I think of myself as a pretty environmentally conscious, aware person. So that was a surprise for me to see that. So the author of the book, The Climate Footprint of Everything, he suggests a climate footprint target of 5 tons per year. So I'm going to invite you right now to pick a target, and you may or may not have ever done a carbon footprint calculator before, but I'm going to invite you just off the top of your head to pick something between 5 tons a year and 15 tons a year, so that the next part of the presentation, when I go through line by line items, you can kind of compare it to that target and see how things add up. Okay, which has the higher carbon footprint? So this is a question I'm posing to you. An apple or a banana? Let's see a show of hands. Who thinks it's the apple? Well, in general, okay? So obviously, if you grew apples in your backyard, it's gonna have a lower carbon footprint than an apple you buy from the grocery store. But in general, which has the higher carbon footprint? Show of hands, who thinks it's the apple? Okay, and who thinks it's the banana? Whoa, the bananas win. Okay, so the answer is, I know you're on pins and needles. The answer is, it's complicated. So air travel is costly from an emission standpoint. 1 mile of air travel is 100 times that of a mile by sea. Bananas are often shipped, or almost always shipped by sea. What goods are air freighted? It's usually perishable things, vegetables, fruits, often coming from South or Central America. It's also flowers, fish, pharmaceuticals, those are all air freighted items. So they're gonna have an inherently higher carbon footprint because of being air freighted. Other things that are air freighted, Amazon packages. I'm guilty of that one. Amazon has a fleet of 110 aircraft. So the sizable footprint that Amazon has. Oh, and by the way, the book, The Climate Footprint of Everything, he says that the apple is slightly less than the banana. All right, the product life cycle, I started to talk about this already. The embedded or embodied emissions that are inherent in a product. So let's first off define embodied carbon emission. It's the amount of greenhouse gas associated with upstream extraction, production, transport, and manufacturing. The stages of a product's life. The stage that's often overlooked is waste disposal. So let's look and go through the life cycle. First off, product design. There is a carbon footprint to designing a product. Then there's the resources, gathering those resources in order to manufacture it, and then the actual production of the product, the packaging of it, the transportation of it, the administration and distribution of it, and then the actual usage of it, the waste disposal and or recycling of it. So there's a lot involved in a simple product. It's all called the life cycle analysis. So here's an example. Baby diapers. When you dispose of baby diapers in a landfill, they emit methane. So when you're looking at the carbon footprint of baby diapers, you have to include the methane gas that's emitted when they're disposed of. And by the way, just as an interesting side note, I found it interesting. The world now consumes more adult diapers than it does baby. Okay. There's a footprint. You probably didn't count. All right. So now we're going to go through quickly line by line items of different things and their carbon footprints just to give you reference ideas. So 1 to 2 pounds of emissions. An ice cream, driving a mile, 4 disposable baby diapers, 2 pounds of trash, a 10-inch pizza, spending $1. I'm just going to mention here about spending money that if you want to follow your carbon footprint, an easy way to do it is follow your checkbook. Where you spend money, almost always, if there's economic impact, ripples of economic impact create ripples of carbon impact. So part of why you saw the US be so high on that chart at number 1 of per capita is because of our wealth. Other items, taking a bath, a 7-ounce serving of fish. 2 to 22 pounds. So a pint of milk, 8 ounces of asparagus. Asparagus is one of those items that's often air freighted. A bottle of wine, a bunch of flowers, a carton of eggs, a load of laundry, 4-ounce burger, 2 pounds of rice. Rice tends to be one of the higher carbon footprint of the grains because rice is grown in rice paddies that emit methane. 22 pounds to 220 pounds of carbon emissions. A pair of shoes, a bag of cement, a night in a hotel, a leg of lamb, a week's food shopping, a bus trip to Denver and back from Durango. 220 pounds to 1 ton. So now we're getting into the bigger figures of emissions. A necklace, Christmas excess, a new carpet, insulating an attic. So now in insulating an attic, the long run, you are going to be reducing your carbon footprint. But there is a carbon footprint to producing that insulation, installing that insulation, and then eventual disposal of that insulation. A funeral, who would have thought, under waste disposal, right, our own bodies. If you have chosen to be cremated, they heat the body up to 750 degrees for over 24 hours. That's a pretty big carbon footprint to a cremation. A pet has a carbon footprint. Larger the pet, the larger the footprint, because the more that they eat, but also there's other costs like the veterinarian costs, all the stuff that you get when you have an animal. It's all part of the footprint. 1 to 10 tons. So now we're really getting into the big figures. They're really going to stack up against your yearly goal of tons. An operation. I personally have had 1 major surgery this year, and in 2 more weeks, we'll be going in for a second major surgery. So I will have an especially large carbon footprint this year. A ton of steel, a ton of nitrogen fertilizer, solar panels. Solar panels being a lot like insulating your attic. In the big picture, it saves on the carbon footprint, but there is a footprint to solar panels. Flying from LA to Barcelona and return. So I'm now going to say something that's going to be very unpopular with my peers. If you want to increase your carbon footprint, step on a plane. If you, just a moment. Air travel is very socially acceptable. The US population dominates emissions from flights of all countries. Even higher carbon footprint than flights is luxury cruises. They have the largest carbon expense. I invite you to get creative on how you can meet your needs and do it in a low carbon footprint way. What do I really need to be happy? All right, 10 to 1,000 tons. Now we're really getting into the big numbers. A new car, a person, their annual footprint, a wind turbine, a new build house, a car crash. It's one of those things you don't really think of having a footprint, but a car crash has a carbon footprint, having a child, and the ultimate waste. Now here I am judging. I have actually suggested that you don't judge other people's carbon footprint choices, but I will judge this one. Space tourism, you can't get more wasteful in a carbon footprint than space tourism. Millions to billions of tons. So now we're talking about the carbon footprint of a large event or a country. A volcano, the World Cup soccer event, world data centers, wildfires, a war. So that one of the things about climate change is that it makes a war much more likely. So there's resource scarcity in climate change, and there's climate refugees, which make resource scarcity even more scarce. The US military calls climate change a threat multiplier in terms of war. And then deforestation. So we've talked up to this point about emitting carbon. Now, what can we do to have negative emissions? Planting trees, marine planting, soil carbon sequestration, and direct air capture and carbon storage. This is my all-time favorite climate book called Drawdown. Has anyone in the audience ever read Drawdown? Ah, we have some fans. Okay, good. It's edited by Paul Hawken. he goes over the 100 most comprehensive solutions globally for climate change. So this isn't on an individual impact, this is on a big scale impact. So he basically makes the roadmap. If we ever get serious about addressing climate change, he's got the solutions right there in the book. And I listened to a interview of Paul Hawken, and one of the things he said was that of all the climate solutions, the one solution that makes all other climate solutions more effective is carbon pricing. And we're going to be talking about carbon pricing in just a couple of minutes. Is it warm in here?
Yeah.
I thought so too. Is there anything we can do about that?
I'm thinking Bryce may have just left to do it.
I think those, it just came on.
Oh, okay. All right, great. Yeah, so I suggest this book.
By the way, that had a carbon footprint.
There you go, good one. Okay. So household emissions. So for your average American, you and I sitting here in this room, where do our carbon emissions come from? In the pie chart, we have food representing 14% of our emissions, home heating, cooling, and other home energy use. If you put these two pieces of the pie together, they form the biggest piece of the pie. And then the stuff you buy, 26% in transportation, 28%. If you take these two, which both have to do with your home, one of the things that I personally did in my house is that I contacted 4Core, and they are in cooperation with Smart Energy Colorado, and they have home energy assessments or audits that they do. A technician will come out to your house, takes him 3 to 4 hours. They do these cool things like heat sensing photography, so they can see where cold air is coming in a door or a window, and evaluate your insulation, your appliances, your water heater, your furnace, all of that, and then make suggestions. It costs about $500 to have a home energy audit done, but there are rebates that get it down to about $95. So if you're interested in that, that's one of the resources on the sheet. The carbon footprint of spending money, I've spoken about that already. With wealth comes carbon responsibility. The US is in the top 10 wealthiest nations in the country. The less we consume, the less our carbon footprint, which is a dilemma because it's fun to spend money, right? Yeah, but we also have a responsibility to something other than just fun. Few more slides, carbon offsets. So if you were to purchase carbon offsets, and the definition of a carbon offset is paying money to have CO2 removed from the atmosphere and stored. So if you were to do that, to purchase carbon offsets, most likely they're going to be used for reforestation, building renewable energy, carbon storing agricultural practices, that's like regenerative agriculture or permaculture, or waste and landfill management. Okay, so challenges of offsets. I'm gonna skip down to the very bottom one first. Offsets are difficult to verify their benefits. How do you know when you give money to a company that says they're gonna do it, that they really do it, right? I mean, how do we know they don't just take the money and run? So there are third-party monitors, yes, thank you, that help, that will verify they actually do spend the money for the carbon offsets that they say that they do. And companies listed on the sheet are ones that are third-party verified. Another challenge of carbon offsets is that some people think it's like a get out of jail card free. Like I can kind of not really have to work on avoiding my my emissions because I'm just purchasing offsets. So I'm not saying don't purchase them. I'm saying they are valid. And I'm also saying we can depend on them heavily. The last thing I'll just mention about offsets is that you can purchase them through airlines. When you purchase an airline ticket, you can purchase them. Airlines include Alaska, American, United, Delta. They all offer offsets when you buy a ticket. To give you an example, 1,000 miles of air travel generate 500 pounds of carbon emissions per passenger. So let's take a trip to Paris. From here to Paris is approximately 10,000 miles round trip, which would generate approximately 5,000 pounds or 2.5 tons of carbon emissions. So if you have a goal for the year of your carbon emissions being somewhere between 5 and 15 tons, a big chunk just happened in a flight to Paris and back, just to give perspective on choices that you make. All right, the ultimate takeaway. So the individual actions that you have matter. Obviously, I don't think you'd be here listening to this talk if you didn't think your individual actions matter. They do. And the scope of the climate problem requires collective action. So the author of the book, The Carbon Footprint of Everything, he spent almost 300 pages explaining how to reduce your carbon footprint. And then he ends at the book, at the end, with ask not how can I reduce my own personal footprint, but how can I push for the system change we all need to make collectively. And with that, I'll be turning it over to John.
Well, when Susan sent me this slide, she said it would be the transition. And I'm trying to figure out how the joy of missing out is a transition to me. But that's how she explained it. And also Chuck in his introduction said one thing I'd like to correct. And that is that I advocate and I do lobby work for solutions to climate change. Not true. I advocate and I do lobbying and I am dead set on one solution, which is carbon fee and dividend. And that's dependent on carbon pricing. So we'll run through all the carbon pricing. Now I studied environmental economics 40 years ago. It hasn't changed that much. If you want to reduce a pollutant and you can put a price on it, then that's what you should do. Economists are unanimous or near unanimous that pricing something that we don't want is the way to get rid of it. And a gradually rising price on carbon emissions will incentivize the market and incentivize the economy to move to solutions. So I view it as the only thing that attacks the problem. If we look at EVs or beneficial electricity or all these other things, they're proposed solutions that may or may not impact to the appropriate degree. But if we attack the problem, and the problem is greenhouse gas emissions, then that will incentivize the market to provide solutions. Carbon emissions are wonderful. They lend themselves to pricing because we can identify the source and the quantity that's extracted, either at the wellhead or the coal mine or whatever. So we know where it comes from, and it's really easy to apply a price to that. If we take methane emissions from a wellhead, that does not lend itself to pricing. That lends itself to mandating best practices. So pricing doesn't work everywhere, but where we can identify the source and quantity of a pollutant, we should price it.
Is the sound okay?
Everybody
Okay.
hear me?
Great.
So some people will be surprised at this. The corporate supporters of pricing carbon, and you'll notice a lot of, who do we see on here that might surprise you? ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, BHP. I like to say, and people tell me, well, that slide's just greenwashing. That's not real. And I like to remind people that the executives, the CEOs, the shareholders have families. They live on this planet. They probably enjoy the same outdoor activities we do. What they're asking for is an even playing field. If we price carbon, then it lets them compete to provide alternatives. Pricing models, we're going to run over the three primary: a carbon tax, emissions trading system or cap and trade, and fee and dividend. Fee and dividend, we might spend more time on. Carbon tax. So carbon tax is real simple. The government would put a tax in carbon at the point of extraction, and that would drive up the price. And as the price of something goes up, people tend to consume less, number one. And number two, it incentivizes the market to find alternatives and to switch to alternatives. So if I'm manufacturing something and right now I'm using a lot of energy to produce it and the price of energy goes up, I'm motivated to use less energy to produce it. So it's not only finding alternatives, it's being more efficient with what we have. Now, the pros, simple to administer, just whack a tax on it. Consistent pricing. Everybody's playing on the same even playing field. Allows planning. Everybody here budget, well, I don't know. Do folks here budget? And most businesses budget. You like to know what your pricing is going to be. So in applying a carbon tax and all the pricing in tax and fees and whatnot that I talk about on carbon starts at a low level and rises over time until we hit the desired outcome. But knowing what that price is and knowing how it's going to rise allows everybody to plan for the future. Cons, people don't like taxes. It's a hard sell. We don't know how big a tax is needed. We don't. Like I say, we start at a certain level and we grow that tax, we grow that price on carbon until we get the outcome we want, which is a sustainable level. Now, big con is how is the revenue used? And this is, to my mind, a huge danger. If we become dependent on that tax, if our government programs become dependent on that tax, then will we manage that tax for revenue or for environmental goals? And we're creating a perverse incentive to manage it for revenue rather than environmental goals. That could actually lead to us encouraging more carbon usage because it means more revenue for other programs. There's a lot of talks about we could use that tax to fund Medicare, all sorts of benefits. No, the point is we want that tax to disappear over time, the revenue to disappear, because that means we're using less carbon. So we don't want to make ourselves dependent on that. Do you think we can actually trust politicians to do that? I worry that it would become a source of revenue and managed as such. Cap and trade. Cap and trade has got a lot of things going for it. We put a cap on fossil fuel production. We set a limit, and that limit reduces over time. So we know we're reducing our emissions. And the way that works is they auction or allocate units of fossil fuel production. So at the start of the year, they would set what our cap is, and then they would auction off that cap to companies for extraction. So it would limit how much companies could extract in terms of coal or fossil fuels. which is a really nice thing. We'd have a set limit. The problem is we don't know what the price would be. The market would determine the price at that time. Very hard for people to budget, very hard for corporations to budget. And it allows for trading of those units. So if I bought a bunch of units for the extraction of fossil fuels and it turns out I overestimated my need, I could sell that to somebody else. Pros, firm limit on production of carbon. That's the biggest pro. And it's not insignificant. Indirectly, it puts a price on it because of the auction process. Proven success in dealing with acid rain. It has been proven to be effective. Cons, uncertain price, uncertain revenue. And both of those things are significant because people like to budget. Complex administration, tracking those carbon credits would require a lot of administration. Who's got them, who's using them. Potentially ugly politics in production allocations. No, it's not potential, it is. If you look at the cap and trade that was implemented in California, if you look at the cap and trade that was implemented in Europe, it took years to get it working in a productive manner. And a lot of that has to do with who gets allocated and how we allocate the units for cap and trade. In Europe, there was a huge issue in Eastern Europe because they have very dirty power plants. They're not nearly as industrialized as Western Europe, and they could not compete for the units of production for greenhouse gases, for carbon, which would have led to a lot of unemployment and serious impacts on the economy there. So they were given free credits. Well, we're giving free credits to the most wasteful users, but we're doing it for political purposes. And it's also because it's not set pricing, it's difficult to administer for international trade. And we'll talk more about that later. The fee and dividend model. Put a fee on what we don't want. And let me talk about fee versus tax. I will always say fee and dividend and not tax and dividend. And that's a legal distinction. A fee is tied to specific benefits, whereas a tax goes into general revenue and can be reallocated for any purpose. So the specifics of this model, we'll get into why a fee is important. Apply this fee where we can identify the source and quantity of emissions. Like I said, the wellhead, the coal mine, carbon emissions lends itself to that. Increase the fee over time until we get the desired result, which is an amount of emissions that's sustainable. We all own the environment. The fee should be returned as a dividend to all in equal shares. Well, that's the dividend part. So in the fee and dividend model, all the monies collected go into a trust fund. That trust fund is distributed on a monthly basis to all citizens and legal residents in equal shares. Now, the nice thing about that is, well, there's a few things, but the people who consume, who pay attention to their carbon footprint and consume less carbon emissions, use less in their lifestyle, derive more benefit from that fee or from that dividend than the high emissions users. The fee incentivizes the development of alternatives to the pollutant. Yeah, it's market-based. Anywhere where you can use less carbon or substitute other sources of energy will be incentivized. Now, it's not only, I'm not the only person who likes it. This was endorsed by 28 Nobel laureate economists, 15 former chairs blah, blah, blah. Economists, about the only thing they agree on is the fee and dividend model. And this is across the political spectrum. I've gone through, if you go to this site, the Economist Statement, you start looking at those, and it's now up around 3,800 or 4,000 economists. I can find them, Marxist economists on the left. I can find people from the Hoover Institute on the left, on the right, left, right. The whole across the board, they like it, which is kind of what got me involved with promoting it. So things we've already talked about. Now, the Economist Statement, they will say tax, because a fee and a tax from an economist standpoint doesn't make a difference. It makes a difference politically. So I will always say fee. In fact, I went into this slide and I changed it to say fee, but then I felt bad about editing their words and changed it back. A carbon tax offers, yeah, hands down, increase over time, encourage technological innovation. One of the things I say over and over and over in all my presentations is we have no idea what the solutions will be. How do we incentivize the imagination of the people that are in college right now, in physics, in chemistry? Incentivizing solutions we can't imagine requires a market. And so we create a market for alternative energy sources. Now, carbon leakage. So we'll talk about this in a minute, a border adjustment. And then all the revenue should be returned. So all that fee money that goes into the trust fund, all of it gets distributed back out to citizens and legal residents. Pros, there used to not be a con on this slide. It was all pros, but I decided I should really be a little bit fair. Effective at reducing emissions, market-based solution, revenue neutral. All the other solutions, we don't know where that revenue is going. And our prices will be increasing. Anybody who tries to tell you the free lunch story on facing greenhouse gas emissions and eliminating them, that we're all going to be better off financially and economically. No, it's going to cost money. So making it revenue neutral and returning the fee money means less impact for us. Social equity. If you look at the carbon footprint of our population, you'll find that the top quintile is about 40% of the carbon footprint, and the bottom quintile is only 5%. But they will get 20% of the revenue. So for the lowest income earners, the lowest household incomes in our economy, they will receive the greatest benefit from the dividend. They will actually be better off because they have the smallest carbon footprint. Cons, increased energy costs. Like I said, I don't believe in a free lunch. Politicians try to sell us free lunches all the time. No, it's going to cost money. The reason we use carbon-based energy, it's cheap. Political resistance. Yeah. There's nothing in this for the politicians. If you look at cap and trade, if you look at a carbon tax, where's the revenue going? It's going to politicians and they get to spend it. So they look at this revenue neutral and go, wait a minute, I can spend that money better than you can. Uncertain stopping point. And that's true on all the carbon pricing models. We don't know how high that price will have to go to achieve the outcome we want. Subsidies, tax breaks, and investment, which is the path we're on right now. And I view I call it the currency of politicians. The currency of politicians, what do they provide? Tax breaks. Why do we have, I don't know, last I looked was somewhat 50,000 pages of tax law, okay? Do you think that's for you and I? Subsidies, they sell subsidies all the time. How much political donations do you think subsidies generate? When they say to this corporation or that corporation, yeah, we'll help you subsidize this plan. That buys a lot of, that buys a whole lot of campaign dollars. Limit options and entrepreneurship. They're predetermining the winners. That PhD that just came out of MIT with an incredible idea, do you think he's going to get a subsidy or a tax break? He's got no income, he's got no money to lobby, but he may have the solution. Live beyond their useful life. You're aware that we still do subsidies for fossil fuel production. I believe it's 4 to 5 billion a year. Okay, that model was implemented back in the 1920s or 1910s when that was a good form of energy. They've never gone away. And subsidies and tax breaks, it's the nature of them. How many people are aware, your gasoline content now 10% ethanol? And that was brought in for two reasons. One was supposed to be environmental, and the second one was energy independence. Well, the EPA was supposed to deliver a report, I believe it was every 2 years or 3 years, on the environmental benefits. They haven't produced that report in probably 15 or 20 years because they discovered it's a disaster environmentally. We don't have the benefits we thought we would get from it. Number two, energy independence. We're the largest producer of fossil fuels in the world. We don't need ethanol to do that. But it created these special interest groups. No politician is going to speak out against it anymore. The last time it was an issue was when Obama ran against McCain. The big issue was, are you going to raise the ethanol subsidies? But where is the first primary? Iowa. What is Iowa economically heavily dependent upon? Corn production. Okay, politicians do not touch it. So whenever you hear about a subsidy for something we currently think is a good idea, ask yourself, are we creating a model that's going to work for us in the future? All these subsidies, tax breaks, and investments create barriers to new people entering the market with new ideas because the other people have a favored treatment. All right, uniform national policy. We need to do pricing at the national level. Local action, state action, we like to feel good about it. We like to think we're doing something favorable. But when we do it on a state level, all we do is encourage what's called leakage. People who use high amounts of fossil fuel energy are just going to move to another jurisdiction. You'll find states competing with each other for companies and whatnot. And it's like, hey, we don't have those environmental restrictions here. Come on over. So this has to be done with uniform national policy. It also makes for consistent trade policy. One of the big issues is we can do everything here. We could have wonderful policies, and we could reduce our greenhouse gas footprint. How does that impact China? How does that impact India? How does that impact emerging economies? So we have to have a trade policy that handles that. And that's when we get into a carbon border adjustment. And again, that's why pricing as opposed to cap and trade is preferable. So in a carbon border adjustment, what we say is, if you put another jurisdiction, whether it be Europe or Brazil or whoever, if you adopt the same price on carbon, then we will not put a tariff on your imported goods. But for countries that don't, we will apply a tariff based on the calculations of how much carbon input goes into what we're importing, okay? So we created incentive with all of our trading partners to adopt the same price on carbon. And again, doing things locally, we need to do it at a national basis. We need to couple it with a trade policy that incentivizes our trading partners. What's the population of the US? What are we at, about 400 million? Okay, well, there's currently 8 billion people on the planet. I can't do the math that quick, but
4%.
thank you. Okay, and the rest of the planet would love to have the wealth and the lifestyle that we have. Okay? And what did you point out? If China had our population, their carbon footprint would be much, much higher. Okay? So we have to have policy that incentivizes our trading partner, which again comes back to a price on carbon and a method of incentivizing our trading partners to do the same. We also have to be incredibly efficient. Right now, we're subsidizing and providing tax benefits to solutions that haven't been proven to be effective. And the problem with that is we can afford it. We are, as a country, we are insanely wealthy. When you just go down and sit on 550 and watch the traffic going by. I'm not talking Bill Gates or Elon Musk wealthy. The people in this room are insanely wealthy if you look at it from a national or a worldwide point of view. The average income, the average household income in the US would put you at the 93rd percentile in terms of the world. So we have to incentivize creating solutions in the most efficient way we can, because then they can be applied to other economies that are emerging. Yeah, energy and income. You can see that we use approximately 4 times the electricity consumption of the worldwide average, and a little more than that in energy consumption. So,
Is it per person?
I believe this is per person. I'm sorry, I should know that, and I don't. All righty. Good grief, it's 7, it's right on.
Whoa.
Good
job.
grief. So we have time for questions. Probably clubbed you over the head several times with this. We have to, we all try to do things that make us feel good. We drive less, we do rooftop solar. We do all these things that it doesn't matter. I'm sorry. The reality is what we have to have is a policy that incentivizes everybody, and that's based on pricing, attacking the problem, not thinking we know the solutions. And the problem is greenhouse gas emissions, and the attack is to price it. So, questions?
I don't have any problem with your economics or even the logic of this, but I've been working started with CCL in 2017.
Right?
And I just don't see any movement on the political front. This is just not an idea that has any political traction, it seems to me. So what do you think about that problem?
I am incredibly saddened by the current state. Okay, carbon fee and dividend, pardon?
Can you repeat the question?
So, Citizens Climate Lobby advocated, we 100%, our sole mission was carbon fee and dividend. And when you joined, that's what it was. When I joined, that's what it was. We had a lot of positive political momentum. If you go back 4 years ago, 5 years ago, there were 7 different bills before Congress. There were some variation on carbon fee and dividend. I read them all. There was one that was outstanding that had a lot of co-sponsors to it. And then we had a change of Congress. We had a change of administration. Unfortunately, when the Democrats came in, they went a different direction. They did the Inflation Reduction Act. And I refer to it as the Political Dependency Act. And I'm sorry, you asked, so are you going to give? It made me incredibly sad because all the subsidies, all the tax breaks, all the incentive for supposedly green technologies created those barriers to pricing emissions. And so right now, there's not a lot of momentum. With CCL, I will still forcefully advocate for carbon fee and dividend. I have not given up on it because it is the single most effective, efficient solution. So I'm still out there waving my hands. And that's a little bit why I spent so long beating up on tax breaks, subsidies, is looking at that big picture. You're right, currently there's no political momentum, and currently it will require a strong leader, and I don't see any in the immediate future, but
Thank you.
sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
It's not an encouraging answer.
I'll also say there's a new study that came out, and I need to go into more depth because I actually want to write an article about it. But in the new study, they studied economies worldwide and carbon pricing. They came up, once again, carbon pricing is the most effective way to address climate change. And I know there are thousands and thousands of volunteers with CCL that are not going to give up. Yes,
So has any other country tried it?
yes. So
Tell me about that.
Canada right now is the largest country that's adopted carbon pricing. There are 11 or 12 provinces in Canada. I can't remember which, but they gave each province the option of how they wanted to format their carbon pricing. So they could do carbon fee and dividend. They could do cap and trade. So they left it up to each province to decide. And if a province made no decision at all, then the default was carbon fee and dividend. And they've been doing that since 2019. The longest province that has been doing it is British Columbia. They've been doing it, I think, since 2008 with great success. And how they decided in their country was that the dividend, instead of being given as a monthly dividend check to people, that they would just not owe income tax. So if, for instance, you got a $4,000 dividend, that would go against your income tax at the end of the year. So that's how they chose to do it, and they're very happy with it. Good question.
Let me, is that still on? Yes. Applying it to income tax is highly regressive. You have to have an income. So people, households that have limited means, that have a low income, which are, again, the people who are not using greenhouse gas-based energy in as large a scale, they got no benefit. So again, that's back to fee and dividend.
More questions?
Did it, Lord?
Sam?
You've heard the old adage, a solution looking for a problem. I'm afraid that a lot of Americans view this as that. But we have increasing opportunity to help folks understand the problem, right? For example, flooding, increased tornadoes and hurricanes, bark beetles in the west, wildland fire increasing. So we need some folks, it seems to me, that really are articulate at explaining, kind of bringing all those things together and say, okay, folks, this is the problem and you guys have the solution.
Thank you. And that's a definite place we should improve the presentation. When I talk about energy costs are going to go up, we're gonna save in another area because our costs of the destruction caused by environmental damage based on greenhouse gases. You're absolutely right. Thanks for that. I'll incorporate that because that's a very, very good point.
Just to add on to that, one of the personal actions that you can take that's extremely meaningful is just talk to the people around you. You have probably more influence than you think. My personal situation in 2015, I had a 5-minute encounter with a friend who was extremely concerned about climate change. I wasn't at all. I was not educated. I was head in the sand. And in that 5 minutes, he recommended 2 books for me to read. I read them and I completely changed the direction of my life. So conversations with friends matter. That's something you can do that I highly encourage. Okay, other questions? Yes.
In politics, it's a dogma that you should never let a good disaster go to waste. And one of the things that's obvious from the events of this last week is that huge sums of money, a couple percent of GDP is going to go into rebuilding. And we have these disasters and it all goes into adaptation or rebuilding. It doesn't go into mitigation. How can we harness that moment in a way that would move the needle such that some of the money is going into mitigation, not just rebuilding in the same damn place?
Did everyone hear the question? Yes.
Repeat it, please. Repeat it.
Okay, that was a long question to read. So how can we be sure in events that are major disaster events like we just had with Hurricane Helene? How can we make sure that the billions that are being spent are not just spent to rebuild, but they're also being spent to mitigate the problem? Did I accurately? Yes.
But let me throw one thing out there, if I may. Did you?
Go for it.
Okay, one of the things we have to do is, right now, and this is a big issue here, we see a lot of insurance being canceled. Okay? And there's a big push for state or federal government to take over that insurance. No, we should resist that. Because insurance is spreading the risk of unexpected events. It's no longer an unexpected event. That's why the insurance is being canceled. So if the federal government or the state government takes that on, it will remove the incentive for people to make good choices about where they build and where they put themselves. I mean, it's a harsh reality getting your insurance canceled, but it's also a message. And so we should resist the government taking over that insurance.
Dick, I saw your hand up. Where, were you?
Make an observation.
Yes, and I
response to his question.
welcome that observation, given your background. Go for it.
And that is that one of the things we need to do is to alter the way we measure economic welfare. That all of the money that goes into rebuilding increases GDP. the losses do not count. And that metric is wrong.
You're right. I gotta put some thought into that, but you're right. This gentleman,
Yeah, in Colorado, when there is an excess tax rebate, it is a flat tax and people who have no income get it anyway. So it's not regressive, and that type of non-regressive return of fees might help this situation.
yeah, and the fee and dividend is everybody gets the same dividend. It's not income dependent. It's legal status dependent. If you're a legal resident or citizen, you get your dividend.
Questions more about carbon offsets, carbon pricing, or carbon footprint?
Okay, I got a quick one for you. All right, just because I love it. I never argue with people over climate change. There's no point. Okay, if they don't get it, they don't get it. But I will present some facts upon occasion. The history of greenhouse gas emissions. How many people are aware that this gentleman in 1896 did the first calculations on global temperature rise based on greenhouse gas emissions. He's a Swedish Nobel Prize winning chemist. And because he's Swedish and he lives in a very cold place, he thought it would be a good thing. It would extend the growing season. But it goes back to 1896 were the first calculations and the first awareness. These two folks, independently working, were the ones who did the science on the heat retention properties of greenhouse gas emissions. 1965 presidential warning. It's not like the politicians haven't been aware of this. The first presidential report was in 1965. We've gone through successive administrations kicking the can down the way. Well, I've read this. It is, okay, I read part of it. When it got into the real science, it went right past me. I took their word for it. But one of the things I loved in this report from that year was we expect to have really big computers in a few years, and we'll give you better estimates. Susan touched on the US military totally sees this as a threat to our national security. If there's a good argument that the civil war in Syria was based on climate change and an extended drought, which created, which exacerbated already existing antipathies between the Sunnis and the Shias. So anyway, that's all. So yeah. Thank you. Don't take it away from you.
All right.
Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
No, thank you. Yeah, it was good. Yeah, it was great. Your presentation, yeah, really good.